Good evening. I want to begin by congratulating the Pregnancy Care Center on 30 years of ministry in the trenches in the pro-life movement here on Staten Island, as they have ministered not only to the physical needs of mothers and children in this community, but also to the spiritual needs of mothers and children in this community. You could not get better work, more meaningful work, than the kind of work that the Pregnancy Care Center of New York is doing. And I count it a privilege to be a supporter of this organization and of this movement, the pro-life movement. I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to share a story with you that will at least begin to shed some light on why it is I am so passionate about this issue and why I would urge you to be passionate about this issue too. I could go over all of the logical reasons for why abortion is wrong, and I could go over all the reasons why it would do damage to someone who has an abortion, or why the propaganda that is so often given to us in the media about, quote, pain-free abortions or mentally pain-free abortions is really not true at all. But I'd rather spend a little time with you just telling you about my own personal transformation to becoming a passionate supporter of the pro-life cause. And in my early 20s, I walked into my local gas station one night and I met a man named Gustavo. Now, I didn't intend on meeting Gustavo when I walked in there, but he was the man behind the counter, and he didn't allow me to walk out without engaging me in conversation. Now, upon seeing Gus, he didn't look like the most friendly guy initially. He was very tall, and he was very big, and he had tattoos over all of his arms, and I later found out over all of his back as well. And yet, the first thing that Gus asked me after I had ordered my gas from my car was, "Hey, bro, do you know Jesus?" And of course, by that time, I did know Jesus. And we struck up a conversation, and pretty soon we struck up a friendship. And so there were many nights that I would go and visit Gus as he was working behind the counter, and we would talk about life as Christians. We would talk about our struggles and share our prayer concerns and all the other aspects of Christian life together. And one night he began opening up to me as we actually were discussing the very issue of abortion. He said to me, "Eric, I am passionately pro-life." And I was a little taken aback by that, because the truth is, even though I was a Christian, I just hadn't put that much thought into the issue when he mentioned it. He then went on to describe his life story to me. He said, all of my life, I was a loser. I hung out with the wrong crowd. I was violent. I was constantly fighting. It didn't take long before I joined gangs, and it didn't take long before I ended up in jail for my gang activity. I was violent, and I didn't have any remorse. And I said, "Gus, why do you think it was that you were a loser and that you were violent and all of these things?" And he said, "I've thought about that a lot, and it's the reason I'm so pro-life." He said, "When my mom was a teenager, she was kidnapped by a neighbor, and she was raped repeatedly. My mom eventually was able to escape from the man's house, but she didn't feel like she could tell anybody about what had happened, and she didn't feel that anybody would believe her. But sure enough, eventually, she became pregnant. And try as she might to hide her pregnancy, she couldn't, and everybody thought that she had just slept with somebody and that now she was going to have a child out of wedlock, which back then was a great dishonor to the family. And so all of the family, all of her friends said, 'You need to get an abortion, you need to get an abortion, you need to get an abortion.' But she didn't. She gave birth to a boy. And she raised this boy up the best she could in her single-parent home. And it was tough because the boy heard over and over and over again that he shouldn't be here. He heard over and over and over again that he was worthless and that his daddy didn't want him. Well, of course, the boy would grow up to be resentful and angry and bitter and wonder why he even existed on this planet. And he said, Eric, that girl, by the world's standards, had every right to have an abortion. But that girl was my mother, and I am the product of that rape. And if she hadn't had gone through the pregnancy and had me, then I wouldn't be here today. When he told me that story, I was taken aback. I had never met anybody that was the product of rape before. And then he said, Eric, I never had a father. I never had a physical father, and I always resented that. But when I met the Lord, I met my true father. And now I know that I'm not worthless and that I'm not a loser, because my Father says he loves me and cares for me, and he's guiding me every step of the way. My Father sent his Son to bleed for me. Well, for me, that sealed the deal. After hearing Gus's story, I became convinced that no life is ever worth ending. That we can always find a way to support those who are pregnant. That we can always find a way to support those mothers who have just had a child and are trying to figure out how they're going to support them. And so I became passionate about this issue. Back in California, where I was originally from, I worked to start a pregnancy care center myself that is still actively working today. And I urge you to do everything you can to support this pregnancy care center here in New York, because you never know which mother of Gustavo is going to walk in there. You never know which child is going to be deeply impacted by the work that the Pregnancy Care Center does. And through your giving, through your digging deep to support this organization, I assure you, you are literally saving lives. The Word of God tells us that it is our duty to act. It is our duty to act on behalf of our neighbor and to show love to our neighbor. One of the ways that you can do that is by supporting this wonderful organization. I urge you to do so. God bless you, and enjoy the rest of the banquet.